Our Words, Our Worlds, writing on Black South African women poets, 2000 to 2018. It's an anthology compiled and edited by poet, anthropologist and writer Makhosazana Xaba. Recently launched, this anthology boasts views and reflections from over 20 women. These include poetry potion, founder Duduzile Zamantungwa Mabaso. Joining us now in the studio is author Makhosazana Xaba and Moshibudi Motimele, mother activist, cultural worker and PhD candidate. She's to my right. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
It's a big book exploring a very big subject. But let's first perhaps start with the literature landscape within the 21st century. I mean, even just talking about women previously, black female writers is something pretty much unheard of. So perhaps, Makhosazana, if you could just take us through, you know, the intention and the history that you've managed to trace.
Okay, so we know that there have always been women who are writing, and particularly because we're talking about a book on poetry, we know that there was Nontsizi Mkweto who was writing and publishing her poetry way back in the 1920s. So, but what happens when people decide who gets into a book or who gets into the journal? We know the history of this country, we know how patriarchy works. Often women have gotten into the published works in very few numbers. So my concern and my motivation for this book was because of that exactly, because what we saw in the year 2005 was 7 women by the end of the year who were new in the poetry scene had new books. Now, for us who were in the poetry scene, we're learning to see one another, and it was like, wow, that's big for 2005. And literary scholars were responding to it and saying there's a proliferation, there's a growth, there's this. But there wasn't, for me, an acknowledgement of that moment in a historical sense, in a sociological sense, if you like, in a feminist sense. Scholars were just looking at, oh, here's poetry that women are doing. Isn't it interesting? They're going into eroticism, they're going into pleasure, they're going into this.
So before we do that, anthropologically speaking, when do we spot the first female writers, and what is defined then as poetry? What was it defined as back then, and is there a difference?
Well, as I said earlier, Nontsizi Mkweto is the one who's quoted as having been a very early female black writer.
I'm just looking at a time period. When we say early, just take us through.
1920s. It was 1920s. And so when I was saying that through the years, women were writing poetry, and when the newspapers were very accessible, that's when Nontsizi was publishing her poetry. But it's taken that long. It was only more recently that her poetry was compiled into a book. So there were newspapers, and then there were journals, and then women were submitting. People will quote a lot The Staff Rider, which was a journal that was bringing into the fore a lot more black contributors. And then we know that also during the late apartheid era, there was COSO, the Congress of South African Writers, which brought people who were writing together, and they were publishing, and then there were women there as well. So there has been a visible growth, but even as we've watched that growth, it's been very easy for women to sort of disappear, if you know what I mean.
Was there a seismic shift in terms of approach on poetry, the subjects that you mentioned, some of that women have been credited with within this period?
I call it a seismic shift in 2005 because we had never seen so many books. And by the way, 7 was the number that we were aware of then. By the time this book came out, I had found 2 others. So there were actually 9 books that came out of individual women with their individual collections in the form of books. So that's what I consider a seismic shift.
So, just looking at some of the books and disciplines explored in this particular book, literary theory, feminism and politics, which is also part of your PhD studies. What has been particularly significant about just noting these trends, but just how it's impacted on our culture?
Right. I think the book does a lot of important things. So Margaret Busby, who we were talking about earlier, who writes an intro to the book, says, you know, it excavates histories, it imagines futures, and it empowers the present. And I think that's a really good summation of what the book does. Because on the one hand, it shows, like Makhosi has been saying, that black women have been writing, right? So this view that all of a sudden there are black women writers is false. So I think it does that type of justice work in terms of the archive. But also just in terms of black women's narratives being told by black women themselves. I think for too long in all of these spaces, whether it be literary, political, sociological, etc., the interlocutors of black women's narratives have always been white women, white men.
And which is what I was going to raise, because when we talk about women in general, they're not homogeneous, and then you filter down to black women as well. That is not necessarily the case.
Right. And I think what the book does is that it shows the contribution of black women, and especially poetry as a form, to all these traditions and disciplines. So whether it is a type of black feminism, whether it's in terms of labor politics or the socioeconomic situation, you know, I think the book is a really important contribution to the ways in which black women's lives and lived experiences have always crossed these sort of binaries that exist, right? Whether it be in terms of the ways in which it's included a cross-generational spectrum, right? So you have interviews at the end with people like Lebo Mashile, who's someone for my generation is a really important black woman poet, you know. So you have these really important cross-generational conversations which show the ways in which black women's narratives and lives have always done the type of interdisciplinary, cross-generational, non-binary
So through
work.
the entry of some of those people that you've mentioned, like Lebuma Shile, who I know is also very passionate about this next question that I'm going to ask, is have we then, in your view, been able to decolonize literary culture?
So I think the word decolonization is a particular intervention, right, which I think the book speaks to but is not premised on, right? So for instance, the idea that you can have, Barbara Boswell writes this beautiful chapter, right, about the contribution of black women writers to pleasure and to fields such as like sexuality, etc. What does it mean to have black creative women right now talking about these types of intimacies which previously might have been taboo, etc. So I don't want to say decolonize because that's a particular genealogy of a politics, right? But I think the work that it does is that it disrupts the boxes that black women have been put into. It sort of disrupts methodologies, it disrupts epistemes, and it uses black women's experiences to show the ways in which black women have nuance, black women have complexity.
And I want to talk about nuance and complexity, Makhosazana, queering the idealized sexual feminine body. I mean, that chapter in the book, perhaps for our audience, like, what does it talk about it? And what are we exploring here? And I'd imagine for black women, it would be seen as foreign for them to own and even write these kind of chapters.
So you're talking about the chapter that Barbara Boswell wrote. So Barbara's focus in that chapter is an interesting one because not only does she look as a literary scholar into the content of the poems, but she also looks at the broader field. You know, these poems are addressing homophobia in the country, and these are the poets, and this is what they do. So they're queering the space in that way, but they're also doing the work of. So moving on from what Moshibudi was saying, women will talk about sex and pleasure and sexuality, but often it's still within what feels normal. So Barbara was looking at, okay, you can address homophobia, you can talk about sexuality in a queer sense, but you can even queer the very poetry and write poetry in a way that feels queer. So that's the work that she does that I think is very, very interesting for the book. I mean, each voice is unique, and that's how unique has been.
And the spoken word having evolved over centuries, over years, and even transatlantically. How does that book reflect that? And again, I go back to, what do we understand as poetry? Because even in academic critiques of what poetry has been, there's been disagreement.
Yes, there has been disagreement, and there's a lot of conversations about it, and there's a lot of definitions. And I try and move away from that a bit, because if you ask me, for instance, when I first connected with poetry, I'll tell you it was in my home. Because in my home, my parents insisted that we can't just say Makhosazana Xaba. We must say Nonkosi, Shwabate, Malupsohlanga, when Agambobozinde. And then we must turn to my mother and say Mbata, Ndabezita, when Agasunchigazi, Kumbila Makwa. That's poetic. If you listen to the stories that are told through Izitagazelo, that's poetry. But were we told that's poetry then? No. It takes time to be adult and say, wow, actually, Izitagazelo Zagiti are so poetic. That's beautiful. So there's poetry and there's poetry. So for me, what I like about this book is actually the fact that I was able to curate something that brings all of those things together. If you look at Duduzile's chapter for Duduzile's essay, it's looking at Izimbongi, women Izimbongi, who are not in the mainstream of poetry. And she looks at how these Izimbongi use their mother tongue to do what they do. So we're moving between that to Tereska Mayshond, who's talking about how she was able to enjoy poetry in Afrikaans when it had taken her some time to go back to her mother tongue, because initially it was like, if Afrikaans is such a big problem, then I'm going to speak English. But then she recognizes that when other poets like Diana Ferris writes a poem in English, there's an Afrikaans version that speaks to her more directly. So it's pulling, so what this book does is to pull through all those versions and varieties of poetry that a lot of us have grown up with. But it's never really set together in one book.
And speaking of growing up with Moshibudi, because I was actually thinking about the same thing that Makhosazana was speaking about, the language, about the cultural divide and appreciation of some of these works. And obviously that would come back to historically what we've, you know, invested in, even if it means growing our own culture. So what have you learned from it? How has that corralled you in your academic sphere and what you're looking for?
So I think for me, this book is a really empowering pedagogical tool to have as both a sort of doctoral student, but as an educator as well, because we want to bring these narratives and voices and methods into the classroom, and yet there's this dominant voice that says, well, there's no academic text, Black women haven't written textbooks or journals, etc. And so I think this book is going to be so important pedagogically, is that it then empowers us as educators and students who are trying to rethink the ways in which these institutions work, to say, well, here they are. These are Black women writing their own stories. Here are their narratives that we can use in our classrooms to empower the type of thinking that we want, you know.
Is enough being done to publish the right kind of works?
So I think there's a politics around publication, right? And I think this book speaks to that politics as well, to say, you know, there's certain forms that are accepted by publishers, but it's also a very white-dominated field in specific places. So I think this book is also a form of activism, right, as well, to publish Black women's narratives and stories by a Black woman editor. So is enough being done? I think the writing is out there, and we've spoken how it exists in different spaces and places, and this book is part of that.
And I know we haven't done it justice, and hopefully at some point we will. But thank you so much to you both, Makhosazana Xaba and Moshibudi Motimele, a mother activist, cultural worker and PhD candidate. And it's about this book, Our Words, Our Worlds. Hopefully you do grab a copy and read more for yourself.